everyone, this is the second part of the lesson 2.04 recording, and we're going to start here on the bottom of page 149 with defeat in New York. In the summer of 1776, Howe was determined to take New York, while Washington was equally resolved to hold it for the Patriots. The British held the advantage in manpower, were 45,000 soldiers to the Americans' 28,000. Moreover, many New Yorkers were loyalists and could be counted on to aid Howe's men. Washington did his best to keep the British from capturing New York, but his campaign got off to a disastrous start. Not knowing whether the British would attack Long Island or Manhattan, the new commanding general made a serious error. He divided his troops, stationing some in Manhattan and others in Long Island. On August 27th, the British attacked Long Island in full force. Startled and poorly commanded, the American troops fled before the British bayonets. Of the brutal fighting in the Battle of Long Island, one American chaplain wrote in his diary, "Oh, doleful, blood, carnage, fire!" The Americans were routed by superior British forces who took more than 1,000 prisoners. In defeat, Washington retreated to Manhattan. The two armies met again with an inconclusive battle in Westchester County on October 28th. Then in November, Howe captured Fort Washington in northern Manhattan, and with it 2,800 American soldiers. "I feel mad, vexed, sick and sorry," cried Nathanael Greene, the American general who had tried but failed to hold his critical outpost. "This is a most terrible event. Its consequences are justly to be dreaded." When the British troops turned their swords on American soldiers who had surrendered at Fort Washington, Washington was appalled. The British then herded more than 2,000 captive Americans onto rat-infested, disease-ridden prison ships where they faced near certain death. Washington, skilled at controlling his emotions, but shattered by the losses, shaken by his own mistakes, and fearful for the cause of independence, wept. Across the Hudson River in New Jersey, another British general, Charles Lord Cornwallis, won a critical victory atop the Palisade Cliffs, capturing a large supply of weapons stored by the Americans. In what became a familiar pattern, Washington avoided complete defeat by retreating, this time deep into the woods and farmland of central New Jersey. For the moment, his army was safe, but they had suffered a series of humiliating losses. And then here's the little excerpt we'll read before we continue. Washington commissioned Nathan Hale, a Connecticut patriot, to disguise himself as a Dutch schoolteacher and spy on the British at Long Island. Hale's identity was discovered, and then he was hanged. A tradition says that Hale met his death with the words, "I regret that I only have but one life to lose for my country." Perhaps you've heard that quote before. It's kind of a famous one. Thomas Paine's American Crisis. Thomas Paine again. Remember, we read about him with Common Sense, and now we're going to read about American Crisis. Washington himself was demoralized, and he needed more troops. He wrote to his brother that if he did not get more men, "I think the game will be pretty well up." Enlisted men and civilians were also discouraged. Some returned to their farms. When General Howe offered a pardon to anyone who would swear loyalty to the crown, more than 3,000 Americans, including the signer of the Declaration of Independence, accepted. Thomas Paine, whose common sense had helped ignite the revolution, was part of the retreat from New York. He had seen firsthand the desperate condition of the patriots. He responded by writing a pamphlet called The American Crisis, which opened with these stirring words. "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will in this crisis shrink from the service of their country, but he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of men and women. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered, yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph." Paine's pamphlet, read aloud in American camps, helped the weary soldiers find hope and strength to face the hard road ahead. And this is actually a pretty famous quote that you'll hear in a lot of sports comparisons and sports, like motivation things. The harder the conflict, the harder the game, the more glorious the win, that kind of thing. And it all comes back to Thomas Paine and the American Crisis and the American Revolution. Washington rallies his Continentals. By late 1776, the American army stood on the verge of defeat. British troops had crushed George Washington's forces in New York. Facing a well-trained and well-armed enemy, the Continental Army suffered a devastating shortage of food, clothing, and blankets. By December, the Americans were playing a game of cat and mouse with British troops, staging retreat after retreat along the border of New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Many in Congress questioned Washington's fitness for his post, and Washington himself had agonizing doubts. He blamed himself for the disastrous defeats in New York. Yet the Continental Army lacked discipline and training. Its diverse regiments from Connecticut, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia sometimes fled the battlefield. They were often at odds with each other and openly critical of their commanders. They were horribly outnumbered, too, but none of the diminished none of that diminished his responsibility as a commander. In December, Washington ordered his troops to pull back. After a numbing 100-mile march through mud and snow, Washington and his men crossed the Delaware River from the New Jersey shore and set up camp in eastern Pennsylvania. The Continental soldiers shivered in the raw December cold. Many of the 3,000 men were coatless and shoeless. They enlisted in the summer and brought no winter clothing. The men huddled by small fires, their faces too stiff with cold to talk. Many were ill, and others intended to go home when their enlistments were up at year's end. Even though Congress had authorized more regiments, it would take time to get new men to Pennsylvania and train them. Washington concluded that he must avoid large-scale battle until his men were better prepared to face the enemy, but he knew he had to do something bold. The soldiers freezing in their tents hadn't given up, but they and the American people needed a battlefield triumph to lift their spirits and renew their determination. The commander resolved to look for a chance at a brilliant stroke. Victory at Trenton. And here's a famous picture of Washington crossing the Delaware, and that's what we're going to read about here at Victory at Trenton. Washington came up with a bold, risky plan. The enemy was close at hand, encamped just across the Delaware River at Trenton, New Jersey. Because armies usually did not fight in harsh winter conditions, Washington knew that neither the British nor Hessians expected a winter offensive. A quick hit-and-run attack, the kind he had seen Native Americans use during the French and Indian War, might be the brilliant stroke he sought. Washington gathered his officers and presented his plan. He proposed a strike against the Hessian regiments across the river. Washington's officers worried over the weather, the river, and the number of boats they would need, but agreed to move forward with the plan. On Christmas night and into the pre-dawn hours of the next day, 24,000 American troops, not 24,000, 2,400 American soldiers moved through the gale forest winds and driving sleet towards Trenton. Whole sections of the Delaware River were frozen. The troops hauled artillery onto flat-bottomed boats and then stood braced against fierce wind and ankle-deep slush as they pushed over the river. Additional forces downriver were unable to cross. Men who sewed clothing stiffened in the bitter cold died of exposure. Others froze to death by the side of the road. Those who could pressed on, many leaving bloody footprints in the snow. By the time the Continentals made it to New Jersey, the campaign was a crucial 3 hours behind schedule and seemed the plan might fall apart. In a moment of tremendous frustration, Washington wrapped himself in a wool blanket, sat down on a wooden crate, and despaired of surprising the town, as I well knew we could not reach it before the day was fairly broke. Alarmed as he was at the prospect of having to attack in the daylight, the general was also certain there was no making a retreat without being discovered. Thus he determined to push on at all events. Through the freezing rain and sleet they made their way toward the Hessian army hired by the British and feared and resented by the Americans. Only months before, Washington had witnessed Hessian soldiers turning their bayonets on American prisoners at Fort Washington. These mercenaries were often ruthless and always disciplined professional soldiers. But after repeated harassment from local militia through the early winter, the Hessians were exhausted. Though they anticipated an attack by the Continentals, they did not expect it to occur during a blinding snowstorm. As dawn broke on December 26, Washington's troops approached Trenton. Hessian guards were on watch, but shrieking winds and pelting sleet hid the impending attack. When the Hessians realized the Americans were upon them, it was too late. American artillery pounded down on Trenton. Townspeople heard the din and the shouts in German, and they didn't understand. Some grabbed weapons and fired with the Americans. They saw Hessians falling on the streets and heard the cries of the wounded and dying. In an hour, the Hessians surrendered. The bone-weary but jubilant Americans made their way back to Pennsylvania on December 27th with 900 prisoners and Washington's orders to treat them humanely. He was determined that his soldiers, fighting for their inalienable rights, would not behave like ruthless killers. On January 2nd, 1777, Washington's troops were on the defensive in Trenton as a much larger British force marched south from Princeton. American riflemen slowed the British advance, but they couldn't stop it. Washington's men were trapped between the Delaware River and a rushing creek. Although the British could not press across the creek that day, their commander, Lord Cornwallis, was certain they would capture Washington and his army in the morning. Washington assessed the situation, talked with his aides, and ordered his troops to build up their campfires as darkness fell. He hoped the light from the fires would lead the British to think that the enemy had settled in for the night. Then on a bitter January night, the American forces, traveling under the cover of darkness, set off on a perilous march to nearby Princeton. Washington's troops hadn't rested or eaten, but they were heartened by the recent victory over the Hessians. In order to make as little noise as possible, they pressed on quickly toward the British encampment. In the morning, they almost managed to achieve the element of surprise, but a British advance guard saw them and gave the warning. British fire panicked some inexperienced patriots, but most American soldiers rallied. When they fired back, the marksmen among them aimed their long rifles at the British officers with deadly accuracy. More British regulars arrived and formed a bayonet line that terrified their opponents. Some American units fled, unnerved by the fixed bayonets and redcoats. Suddenly, Washington rode on to the chaos to direct them. The soldiers watched as he pushed his white charger forward, an easy target. The men knew their commander's reputation for bravery, but they expected to see him die before their eyes. The general ignored the danger. Amid the smoke and noise, Washington urged his men into formation, and they turned back to the fight. "Parade with us, my brave fellows," he shouted. "There is but a handful of the enemy, and we will have them directly." Inspired by his bold presence, the Continentals surged forward to win the fight. A Pennsylvania officer wrote to his wife about Washington's courage and bravery he inspired in others. "I shall never forget what I felt at Princeton on his account when I saw him brave all the dangers of the field, and his important life hanging as it were by a single hair, with 1,000 deaths flying around him. Believe me, I thought not of myself." Coming on the heels of the Trenton triumph, the Patriot victory at Princeton prompted a British officer to write that though it was once the fashion of this army to treat the Americans in the most contemptible light, they had now become a formidable enemy. Okay, let's read this little excerpt about inoculating the troops. At the time of the Revolutionary War, disease and infection caused more fatalities in battle than guns and cannons. In particular, George Washington was concerned about an epidemic of smallpox ravaging the North American continent. American troops, he said, had more to dread from smallpox than from the sword of the enemy. Inoculation against the disease was still a hazardous treatment, but in early 1777, Washington ordered the first ever mass inoculation of military troops. From then on, every recruit who joined the Continental Army had to be inoculated against smallpox. Some historians believe this decision was crucial to the eventual American victory. Okay, and continuing back here with the Continental Army revives. The battles in Trenton and Princeton were not large battles, but they constituted a major turning point. A bedraggled army with an inspiring commander had challenged and defeated the best troops the British had. From that time forward, American independence no longer seemed merely wishful thinking. Americans began to believe that they could win the war. Against small surprise raids, the British no longer had the upper hand, and they knew it. Soon Americans throughout the country knew it as well. A growing number of men enlisted in the Continental Army for the duration of the war, as their contract stated. The victories also made clear to everyone that the Continental Congress had made a wise choice when it asked General Washington to head the Continental Army. Although he did not have much experience in combat, he learned quickly how to confront the enemy. He also learned to adapt his leadership to men of diverse backgrounds, from backwoods frontiersmen to Pennsylvania farmers to New York artisans and merchants. People who are unused to restraint must be led, Washington wrote. They will not be drove. Finally, the triumphs of Princeton and Trenton showed the tremendous commitment of the American Continentals. A captain in a Connecticut regiment observed, "The resolution and bravery of our men, their order and regularity, gave me the highest sensation of pleasure. What can't men do when engaged in so noble a cause?" From Saratoga to Valley Forge. The war was far from over. With most of Washington's forces positioned in New Jersey during the summer of 1777, General Howe decided to attack Philadelphia, the capital city in Pennsylvania and home of the Continental Congress. Washington hoped to defeat Howe in battle before the British army reached Philadelphia. Helping Washington plan his assault was a young French nobleman, the Marquis de Lafayette. Lafayette believed so fervently in the American cause he left his home, sold many of his possessions, joined General Washington's staff, and donated money to the American army. On September 11, 1777, American and British armies met in Brandywine Valley, an area southwest of Philadelphia that was home to many peace-loving Quakers. After hours of fighting, the British army defeated the Patriots. Lafayette, in his very first battle, was shot in the leg, but he survived. Howe was free to march into Philadelphia, where the Second Continental Congress was then meeting. The members of Congress fled in haste, leading west to Lancaster and then to New York. And I'll stop with this recording here and start with the next one at the Battle of Saratoga.